This past week, our Open and Affirming group launched the hashtag Rainbow Mondays campaign. We began this campaign on Monday, February 1st, the date in 1960 that the sit-in movement began. Later in this sermon, I'll look more closely at the Rainbow Mondays campaign. At its heart, it is an expression of being a loving church family. Today, we will focus our attention on being a loving church family. This is one of our 4 core values with spiritually alive, making disciples, and neighborhood engagement. Loving church family is based on the love commandment found in John 13, verses 34 and 35. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. Within the early church, the love commandment was formational. It guided the way early Christians practiced their faith. Statements of the key importance of loving one another abound throughout the New Testament. This is especially true in the first letter of John, 1 John 2, verses 7 through 11, 1 John 3, verses 11 through 23, 1 John 4, verses 7 through 21. Paul's well-known call to love in 1 Corinthians 13 highlights the centrality of love within the faith practice of the early church. Paul also calls for loving one another in Romans, Galatians, and 1 Thessalonians. Loving one another is also lifted up by Peter in 1 Peter 1, verse 22, and 1 Peter 4, verse 8. The point is that the love commandment is interwoven into the very foundation of the early church and its everyday faith and practice in the everyday life of a disciple in the early church. The love commandment has always been a core value among those who seek to be Jesus' disciples. We express this most clearly in our church in being a loving church family. In our gospel lesson today, from Mark's first chapter, we have Jesus modeling love for one another. Jesus goes with his first disciples to the house of Simon and Andrew. Simon Peter's mother-in-law is ill, and Jesus heals her. The text then says that she began to serve them. The meaning of this is not that she is locked into an assigned gender role, that of a woman serving a group of men. The core message of this passage is that once she has been healed, she immediately begins to act like a disciple of Jesus. For to be Jesus' disciple is to serve others. That evening, sick and demon-possessed people from the whole area are brought to the house door to be healed. We might consider this to be the first house church, a place where people are healed and disciples are made. Jesus then goes in the early morning, before dawn, to a place he can pray in solitude. When the disciples find him, Jesus tells them that it is time to move on to the neighboring towns. We learn from these verses that Simon Peter was married and that he and his brother Andrew own a home. We learn that people come to this house to be healed when Christ is present there. We learn that being a disciple is embodied through the act of serving. We learn that Jesus practices self-care with times of solitude and prayer. We learn that Jesus' call to come, follow me, is a call to engage the world with an outward mindset. We learned that inner reflection and spiritual renewal are essential, but the point of reflection and renewal isn't to secure a home base to safely wait for people to come. Rather, right from the beginning of his ministry, Jesus understands that his mission, what he has come to do, is enacted in building a diverse, loving, inclusive community, and that means to go. Grace breaks into our lives as we practice the core value actions of loving church family. We celebrate diversity and love as we build an inclusive community. We love and nurture each other as we connect in fellowship. We share Christ's love and compassion by caring for one another. The brave space work of the tri-conference ministries of 3 Midwestern UCC conferences provides a guide for building an inclusive community. The document, Our Faithful Commitment to Extravagant Welcome and Being an LGBTQ plus church, inclusive church, focuses on one type of welcome and inclusion. Many UCC open and affirming congregations have found that radical inclusion expands to embrace all people through the intentional embrace of LGBTQ people. Think of radical inclusion as being like learning a second language. First, you learn some words and phrases and grammar. At first, you translate into your native language. However, as you gain fluency, you begin to be able to think in that second language. Your brain has created new narrow pathways. These narrow pathways then make it easier to learn yet another new language. Learning radical inclusion creates new heart pathways. ONA congregations first create a heart pathway to embrace radical inclusion of LGBTQ plus people. As we become fluent in this form of radical inclusion, our hearts and minds are able to think and act in a new way. We then find that adding other forms of radical inclusion becomes easier. At some point, radical inclusion becomes second nature. When this happens, loving one another and being a loving church family becomes a core part of who we are as a community. Jesus points out in the love commandment that it is by loving one another that others will know that we are his disciples. this is exactly what happened in the early church. As people embraced loving one another as central to the faith practice of the Jesus community, others were drawn to this radical new way of living. These new people were embraced and included fully. They became part of this community where people loved one another, which in turn set up another cycle of radical inclusion and loving one another. In our radical inclusion of LGBTQ plus people, we affirm the beauty and blessedness of God's creation is present in all peoples. We don't begin by saying, we welcome everyone. We intentionally start with those others marginalized. This creates the cycle of radical inclusion that radiates out to others. We embody loving one another from the margins in, not the center out. Because going from the center out often becomes the center focused inward on itself. By attending to the margins, we actually practice being an inclusive community. If we try to start with, we welcome everyone, we never move beyond the place where the language says everyone, but the practice says those already inside, the privileged. If we welcome everyone was actually true, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer people would already be fully affirmed and embraced in every church. We know there is work to be done because many churches still insist on harming LGBTQ plus people in the name of God. Being an inclusive community where loving one another is practiced means renouncing theologies, ideologies, and doctrines that oppress or exclude anyone of any sexual orientation or gender identity. It is only by challenging the thought systems that oppress the marginalized that we can actualize loving one another as an inclusive community. Our hashtag Rainbow Mondays campaign is one way we can show the extravagant love of Jesus in a concrete yet simple way. The basic idea is this: wear a rainbow symbol, a ribbon, a tie, a mask, a hat, a cross, a shirt on Mondays. Take a picture and post this picture on social media with the Rainbow Mondays hashtag. By doing this, you publicly show your solidarity with LGBTQ plus people. Imagine the impact that a local church, even a small one, can have on their community if most of the people in that church took this simple, concrete action, wearing a rainbow symbol, taking a picture, and posting the photo with the hashtag Rainbow Mondays on social media. An inclusive community where people love one another. Hold in prayer for a moment gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer youth who might feel isolated and alone, with their families rejecting them and their entire social world seemingly opposed to who they are as a person. Hold this hurt in prayer. Now imagine the potentially life-saving impact that a small church that affirms lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer youth as persons blessed, as children of God, that they are persons who are fully embraced and radically included in this Jesus community where people love one another. And imagine the impact that that church can have as it reaches out to teachers and students and to other churches to join this really simple weekly action. This is hashtag Rainbow Mondays campaign in a nutshell. This is celebrating Jesus' call to love as an inclusive community. This is embodying our core values as a loving church family. This is love in action. Amen.